Hi, this is Keith. This is the lecture for Chapter 17. If you haven't read that chapter yet, it's a good idea to do that first and then watch this presentation. In this lecture, we'll discuss issues related to sexual harassment, harassment and discrimination against gender and sexual minority individuals, sexual assault, and child sexual abuse. Now, before we begin, the chapter and lectures really involve discussion of difficult topics, such as sexual harassment and assault. Please be sure to give yourself the type of self-care you need as you work through the material. Let's get started. In the study of sexually aggressive behavior and its consequences, earlier researchers tend to focus on rape. Rape is usually defined as penile vaginal penetration performed against a woman's will through the use of force or threat of force. However, contemporary research focuses on a broader range of sexual-related behaviors against another person, regardless of gender. This can include, but is not limited to, non-consensual sexual contact involving sexual penetration, sexual touching, sexual harassment, and stalking. So let's first take a closer look at sexual harassment. Sexual harassment refers to two distinct types of behaviors. The first is an abuse of power for sexual ends and can include unwelcome sexual advances or requests for sexual favors, sometimes as a condition of employment or instruction. It should be noted that only a person with power over another can commit the first kind of harassment. So, what are some examples of people in power? Now, these can include bosses, teachers, and mentors. The second is a creation of a hostile environment when someone acts in sexual ways that interfere with a person's performance at school or in the workplace. We'll get into some examples of these in just a few slides. Now, it's really critical to understand that sexual harassment in the workplace is illegal. So it's important to know how it is officially defined by the government. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 first made various kinds of discrimination, including sexual harassment, illegal in the workplace. It applies to employers with 15 or more employees, including local, state, and federal employees, employment agencies, and labor organizations. Additionally, the guidelines from the Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, issued guidelines for what defines sexual harassment, which includes unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other conduct when that conduct first explicitly or implicitly affects an individual's employment, also when it unreasonably interferes with an individual's work performance, and then finally when it creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. So what are some examples of what we mean by sexual harassment? It includes making sexual remarks or telling jokes that are insulting or offensive, making remarks about a person's clothing, body, or sexual activities, saying crude sexual things to a person when they do not want to, using social or online media to send unwanted sexual remarks, pictures, or videos to a person, engaging in unwelcome touching or patting or pinching, and brushing against a person's body. Also, making demands for sexual favors with threats concerning one's job or student status. And then finally, masturbating in front of an unsuspecting person can also be considered sexual harassment. Now, sexual harassment commonly occurs in the school or the workplace, as well as other settings. Stalking is one type of harassment that may not be explicit sexually. However, it most often involves a prior intimate partner and can include being watched or followed, being repeatedly contacted, and threats of physical harm. Now, unfortunately, stalking is common. A large study of college students found that queer students reported the highest levels of being stalked since arriving at college, with 12.1% for queer undergrad students. 6.7% of female undergrad students reported being stalked since arriving to college, and 2.2% of male undergrad students reported that. So, what kind of activities are usually involved in stalking? Here you see that the stalking tactics used against women and men who reported being stalked in their lifetime. 76% of females and 75% of males reported unwanted phone calls. 61% of females and 49% of males said that they were approached or their stalker showed up. 60% of females and 36% of males reported that they were followed and watched. 56% of females and 61% of males said that they received unwanted text photos, emails, and or emails through social media. 30% of females and 16% of males reported receiving unwanted messages, including text and voice or unwanted phone calls. 23% of females and 21% of males reported that their stalker sneaked into their home or car. 70% of females and 21% of males said their stalker used GPS to monitor or track them. 14% of females and 16% of males reported they got unwanted gifts. 9% of females and 12% of males said that their stalker used technology to spy on them. And most alarming is that 91% of females and 70% of men said that they felt fearful, were threatened, or concerned for their safety. 69% of females and 80% of males were threatened with physical harm. So again, we're talking about some quite serious stalking behaviors. Now, an important question is, what is the relationship between the victim and the stalker? Here you see the results of a study that showed the relationship among male, female, and queer and trans students with their stalker. The most common relationship with a stalker were someone I had dated or was intimate with. That was reported by 33% of males, 38% of females, and 36% of trans or queer students. Someone I know or recognize but was not a friend was reported by 33% of males, 31% of females, and 38% of queer and trans students. Um, Someone who is a friend, that was reported by 27% of both males and females and 24% of trans and gender queer persons. Another one was at the time, it was someone I was dating or intimate with. And that was reported by 17% of males, 14% of females, and 14% of queer and trans students. A classmate was reported by 17% of males and females and 18% of queer and trans persons. And then there was about 12% of males and 10% of females and 60% of queer and trans persons who said that they didn't recognize or know the person. So, how do you decide what is harassment and what is flirtation? It helps to first define what we mean by flirtation. Flirtation is an ambiguous goal-oriented behavior with potential sexual or romantic overtones. This may take the form of a smile, a compliment, and other nonverbal behaviors. But whether flirtation is sexual harassment depends on three factors. Whether you have equal power, we know that unequal power may make it difficult to refuse a flirtation or understandably lead to fears of reprisals if the flirtation is not reciprocated. The second dimension is whether you are approached appropriately. This can sometimes feel ambiguous. If a professor asks you if you want to grab coffee on campus, it may be hard to know if they just want to talk about career plans or getting feedback on a course, or whether there are other intentions. In these kinds of cases, it's okay to decline. And then a final factor is whether you wish to continue contact. If you do not wish the contact to be continued, then not responding or asserting that you prefer that the contact um, not be continued is the best course of action. And research shows that culture, gender, and power differentials complicate the issue. For example, men are less likely to perceive different behaviors as harassing than women, and men also tend to perceive a woman's friendliness as sexual interest. So these biases can obviously contribute to the problem. Now, sexual harassment on college and university campuses has become a major concern since nearly 42% of students report being victims of sexual harassment since enrolling in college. Most universities and colleges have developed sexual harassment policies and responses. On this slide, you see a link to the policy for the entire California State University system. Here you see types of sexual harassment tactics experienced by female, gender and trans, queer and trans students and male students since entering college. Now notice that in all cases, fewer men reported these incidents than women and transgender or non-binary students. But importantly, all genders reported some level of sexual harassment, and the most prominent forms were someone said offensive sexual remarks, stories, jokes, pictures, or videos of them that were transmitted. The second one that was very common was that someone said inappropriate or offensive comments regarding your body, appearance, or sexual activities were made against them. Also, a common type of sexual harassment tactics was that someone said crude or gross sexual things or tried to engage in sexual conversation. Again, you can take a look at sort of the rates of these on the slide. All right, so issues of harassment are complicated in the workplace because it is an important place for adults to meet potential partners. For this reason, sexual undercurrents or interactions often take place at the workplace. However, the line between flirtation and harassment can be problematic, especially because of the gender differences between how people perceive flirtatious behaviors and who they attribute the issues to if problems arise. Now, unfortunately, many people do not realize that they are being harassed until much later. Media attention and allegations of harassment against famous men more recently have led to a sort of slow reckoning of these issues. So in 2017, allegations against Harvey Weinstein led to a landslide of sexual harassment accusations and admissions and the firing or resignation of many powerful figures. And there has been sort of a groundswell of sharing of sexual harassment incidents with the social media hashtag #MeToo. So it's only because of this sort of public pressure that was involved in these movements that industries and the US Congress have begun to tackle sexual harassment in the workplace. So, what are the workspaces where sexual harassment is most likely? So, studies show that it tends to be most pervasive in male dominated occupations such as the military and financial sectors. In addition to other meanings, sexual harassment in male dominated occupations is a way of exerting control and asserting dominance in these spaces. And it's important to know that persons of all genders may be victims of sexual harassment, although it is most prevalent for females and people who belong to the LGBTQ plus community. Now, harassment can have a variety of consequences for the victim, including depression, anxiety, shame, humiliation, and anger, which is often compounded by the way that the legal system has historically neglected survivors. A notable form of harassment is street harassment, which is defined as sexual harassment in public spaces. Gender-based street harassment is unwanted attention forced on a stranger in a public place without their consent because of their actual or perceived sex, gender expression, or sexual orientation. Now, this can take many forms, but it can include calling out offensive comments, stating homophobic or transphobic slurs, leering, flashing, and assault. Studies show that persons of color and those who identify as part of the LGBTQ plus community are disproportionately impacted by street harassment. And unfortunately, it is often difficult to have any legal course of action when this occurs because street harassment occurs between strangers. Here you see the percentage of people who experience forms of sexual harassment in public spaces in their lifetime. The figure you see here is divided between those who are cisgender women, cisgender men, and then gender expansive individuals that include transgender and non-binary persons. A higher percentage of gender expansive individuals report harassment in public spaces, regardless of the type of harassment, more so compared to cisgender women and men. However, cisgender women also reported high levels of this type of harassment. You can take a look more closely at the types of harassment that occurs in public venues by gender by pausing this slide. So let's dive into issues around the harassment and discrimination of gender and sexual minority persons. Now, there are two forms of discrimination based on sexual orientation: heterosexual bias and anti-gay prejudice. Heterosexual bias is the tendency to see the world in heterosexual terms and to ignore and devalue homosexuality. Sometimes this is referred to as heterosexism, heterocentric behavior, or heteronormative behavior. As we talked about in prior lectures, heterosexism is widely accepted in society, media, and the family. Depictions of what are acceptable relationships and sexual behaviors on television overwhelmingly favor heterosexuality. Now, this bias can take a number of forms. One way is to just ignore the existence of LGBT persons, essentially cutting them off as part of contemporary culture. Another way is to segregate them by denying them the opportunity to integrate into society. And a third tactic is to assume gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people into a larger category without acknowledging important group differences. Now, the second form of discrimination based on sexual orientation is anti-gay prejudice, which is a strong dislike, fear, or hatred of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people because of their sexual orientation. Now, it should be noted that anti-gay prejudice is not necessarily the same as homophobia. Homophobia is specifically an irrational or phobic fear of LGBTQ plus persons, whereas anti-gay prejudice may not necessarily be irrational, but it is unreasonable and biased. And as all of us know, anti-gay prejudice justifies discrimination that can take many forms, including discrimination in housing, employment, the adoption of children, and parental rights. This has real consequences for LGBTQ plus persons, including higher rates of poverty, poor quality of healthcare, harassment, bullying, physical violence, and suicidal ideation and attempts. And anti-gay prejudice can influence parents' reactions, often resulting in estrangement and possibly homelessness and food insecurity for LGBTQ plus youth. At times, violence against sexual minorities has been sanctioned by religious and governmental institutions. For example, in the Middle Ages, the Inquisition targeted those who they thought were sodomites, which was punishable by death or burning. Homosexuals were among the first victims of the Nazis, and it's estimated that about 50,000 were killed in concentration camps. Hate violence is a persistent issue for all LGBTQ plus persons, and also persons affected by HIV. In 2020, nearly 17% of all documented hate crimes were committed due to sexual orientation, and certainly violence against transgender persons has existed for many years, but is increasing in rate in recent years. So how do we address anti-gay prejudice? The first way is through education and positive social advocacy and interactions. Another way is to create legislation and to successfully argue in the courts that guarantees for gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender individuals to have equal protection under the law. One significant legal advance was the lifting of the U.S. military's Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, which banned openly gay military members. Another very recent decision came down from the Supreme Court in June of 2020 when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 said that it covers both sexual orientation and gender identity as protected classes in the workplace from discrimination. But in 2017 and 2018, President Trump issued directives banning most transgender individuals from serving, and that order has been again reissued since he took office in 2025. So here you see sexual orientation equality laws and policy tallies by state in 2023. It highlights that there are 13 high sexual orientation policy states plus Washington, D.C. So in these states, there were high numbers of policies that protected sexual orientation expression. In addition, there were 8 medium sexual orientation policy states, 7 states and 3 territories that have fair sexual orientation policies, 17 states and 2 territories with low sexual orientation policies, and 5 states that have negative sexual orientation policies. Now, again, since this was done in 2023, policies in some states may have already shifted since then. Here you see a map of the US with the degree to which state laws and policies explicitly address or impact gender identity or expression. It shows that there are 16 states in Washington, D.C. that have the most laws and policies that protect gender expression. 5 states have a medium gender identity policy tally, and 1 state and 1 territory have a fair gender identity policy tally, 8 states and 1 territory have low gender identity protections, and then 20 states and 3 territories have negative gender identity protections. Now, since again, this was done in 2023, the number of states that have negative laws and policy tallies has grown in 2025 under the current administration's anti-transgender policies. So the next thing we'll discuss are issues around sexual assault. Now, assault is an act of violence and aggression that forces its survivors into an intimate physical encounter against their will. Now, historically, many people thought that the primary goal of sexual assault was sexual gratification. But in the 1970s, there was a growing recognition that the principal motive may be power, not sexual gratification. In any case, the survivor of sexual assault experiences terror, not pleasure. And unfortunately, sexual assault is a fact of life for many women, especially those who are young and racially and ethnically diverse, but less common for men. About 21% of women and 3% of men are victims of rape at some point in their lifetimes. This translates into millions of people, including persons with diverse gender identities. Males may be assaulted by anyone of any gender. However, it is most often by other men. Historically, rape in many state laws referred to vaginal penetration, while sodomy referred to anal penetration. However, states have begun to replace the term rape and sodomy with more gender-neutral terms such as sexual assault or criminal sexual conduct to acknowledge that the survivor's sex and gender may vary. Male rape survivors suffer from fears similar to those felt by female rape survivors, including the false belief that they enjoyed it or somehow contributed or consented to it. Rape can differ in type and context. One form is statutory rape, which is a consensual sexual contact with a person younger than the state's age of consent. But what is considered statutory rape can differ by state. In some states, factors such as age differences, the age of the survivor, and the age of the defendant are considered. And enforcement is generally sporadic or arbitrary and may depend on whether the prosecutors take these allegations seriously. Another type of assault is that which is perpetrated by a spouse or ex-spouse called marital rape. As with other forms of assault, these include unwanted sexual behaviors that are committed without consent, against a person's will, and done by force, intimidation, and when a person is not able to consent. So marital rape is common, experienced by 10 to 14% of married women with higher prevalence among married women who are abused. And type of assault, because this type of assault is committed within marriages, it is often not reported or the victim may not realize that it's rape. So here you see the estimated percentage of women and men who experience different types of sexual violence in their lifetime in 2015. 44% of women and 25% of men reported experiencing some sexual violence that involved contact. 21% of women and 3% of men reported being raped. 1% of women and 7% of men said that they were made to penetrate. 16% of women and 10% of men reported sexual coercion. 38% of women and 18% of men said that they have experienced unwanted sexual contact. Campus sexual assault is a massive problem. 1 in 5 women report being assaulted or raped while in college, and certainly many more rapes occur than are reported. As you may be well aware of, college culture can fuel sexual assault, and students are particularly vulnerable during their freshman and sophomore years. And because of the fear of reporting assaults, many rape cases go unreported. Perpetrators often prey on those perceived as vulnerable, sometimes using alcohol and date rape drugs to make it easier. And a majority of survivors are assaulted at parties by someone that they know. Reasons for assault are many, but include misplaced beliefs about rape. For example, men who believe in rape myths are more likely to see alcohol consumption by another person as a sign of sexual availability, when that's obviously not the case. Here you see the percentage of college students by gender who experienced non-consensual sexual contact involving physical force or an inability to consent. So you can pause here to take a closer look at the differences in percentages. I just wanted to point out a few overarching findings. First, women and those who identify as transgender, questioning, or non-binary are more likely to experience assault more than men. Second, those with non-heterosexual identities, including LGBTQ plus persons, are more likely to report sexual assault more than those with heterosexual identities. In order to understand why many assaults and rapes go underreported, it's important to know about the myths about rape, which there are many. Those include the following. Again, these are myths: that rape is a crime of passion, that women want to be raped, this idea that she wanted sex, this idea that people are asking for it. Again, another myth is that women do not fight back or scream, so the person did not fight back or scream, so it wasn't rape. That people are raped only by strangers, which we know definitely isn't true. That they could have avoided rape if they really wanted to. Another myth is that women cry rape for revenge, and that persons who rape are crazy or psychotic. Another myth is that most persons who rape are a different race ethnicity than their victims. Another myth is that men cannot control their sexual urges. Also, that rape is no big deal. And then the final myth on the slide is that men cannot be raped, which is definitely not true. So again, these are myths about rape, but again, these myths tend to fuel people's beliefs about things and then also actions or inactions. An important dialogue that has been happening recently around around sexual harassment is around sexual consent. So, what does it mean to give consent to a possible sexual partner? Four meanings of consent have been suggested and include the following. One meaning is that consent is an internal state of willingness that cannot be observed. A second idea is that uh, consent is an act of explicitly agreeing to do something. So this is more like a contract where one party gives explicit verbal consent to have sex. A more subtle meaning of consent is that it is a behavior that someone else interprets as willingness. So under this meaning, consent is interpreted by the sex partner by certain behaviors. And finally, a fourth meaning is conceptualized um, as consent as distinct from wanting. So just because someone may want to have sex doesn't mean that the person consents to have sex. This may be, for example, because the partner does not have a condom. Currently, there seems to be some agreement that affirmative consent should be sought. This is a standard that requires individuals trying to initiate sexual activity to get the other person's consent before proceeding to having sex. Silence or lack of resistance cannot be interpreted as consent, and non-consent must be assumed in these cases. So, guided by affirmative consent, in state-funded California colleges and elsewhere, the traditional no means no has been replaced with yes means yes. So, what does this mean? It means that the burden is on obtaining a yes instead of on stating a no. So, whoever initiated sex is the person responsible for obtaining a yes to having sex with their partner. And it is not the responsibility of the partner who did not initiate sex to say no. So, it also means that the lack of protest or resistance does not mean consent. People don't protest or resist for many reasons, and therefore the lack of doing so should not be seen as consent. It also means that consent must be ongoing and can be withdrawn at any time, and that intoxication cannot be used as an alibi for not obtaining consent. While critics of affirmative consent argue such policies are vague, impractical, and difficult to prove legally. In other words, there's still a lot of work to do to get consensus about what exactly consent means. Men are more likely than women to think of male-female relationships as a battle of the sexes and to see refusals as an expected part of that battle. So this has been part of our sexual scripts for a long time. According to the script, it's the woman's role to initially refuse sexual advances and the male's role to continue to make them until she acquiesces. Now, this kind of persistence in continuing to make sexual advances on someone who has already refused is called post-refusal sexual persistence. So, post-refusal sexual persistence behaviors should be thought of as sexually coercive and not tolerated. Now, we know discussions of assault and rape are difficult, in part because the aftermath of the experience is painful and may take years to fully address. We know that about 90% of rape survivors report physical injury. And on top of physical injury, there are a lot of possible negative psychological outcomes that may occur. And these include developing post traumatic stress disorder, experiencing depression, anxiety, restlessness, and guilt, and concerns about physical safety. Women, more than men, may experience physical symptoms such as asthma, irritable bowel syndrome, frequent headaches, and chronic pain, as well as difficulty sleeping and limitations in their activities. Overall, survivors are also more likely to develop a mental disorder. The physical and psychological scars of assault and rape take a ton of courage and support to face and deal with. Here you see the results of a study that looked at the percentage of behavioral and emotional consequences of assault experienced by college women. The consequences of avoiding or trying to avoid the persons has the highest value for both persons who experience non-consenting sexual touching as well as sex involving penetration. Other highly reported consequences are fearfulness or concerns about safety, feeling hopeless or helpless, loss of interest in daily activity, withdrawing from friends, nightmares or trouble sleeping, and feeling numb or detached, among other consequences. Again, feel free to pause here and take a closer look at the slide. Okay, we're going to change topics again and discuss child sexual abuse. Child sexual abuse is defined as any sexual related activity between an adult and a child or any minor. Now, it is not limited to penetration, force, or pain, or touching. Rather, it involves an adult engaging in any sexual behavior or sexual way with a minor. Child sexual abuse is a massive problem, with about 600,000 cases of child sexual abuse reported in 2021, with higher rates among girls than boys. A growing and serious type of child sexual abuse is the making and downloading of sexual images of children on the internet. The viewing of such images is considered participating in the abuse. There are also cases in which sexual touching between children can be considered child sexual abuse when there are significant differences in age, development, or size. The age gap is usually 3 or more years to be considered abuse. In any case, an important component related to child sexual abuse is that children cannot give informed consent. Perpetrators often have a very distorted view that the child consenting to is consenting to the contact without acknowledging that this is actually not possible. So while we know it's a huge problem, it is difficult to know how many children are sexually abused because so many cases go unreported. An important aspect of understanding child sexual abuse is knowing the relationship between the victim and the perpetrator. Here you see the relationship between the child survivor and the perpetrator of sexual abuse, separated by whether the survivor is male or female. So a few things that really stand out. By far the most common is that the perpetrator is often another juvenile or peer. For female survivors, an adult acquaintance or a girlfriend or boyfriend is more likely to be the perpetrator than for males. But for male survivors, a non-adult family member is more likely to be the perpetrator than for female survivors. Feel free to pause here and take a closer look at the slide. Now, the Rape, Incest, and Abuse National Network, or RAIN, offers guidelines for detecting sexual abuse. These include behavioral warning signs such as shrinking away, regressive behaviors, inappropriate sexual behaviors, and nightmares, displaying physical signs such as bruising or swelling, seeing blood or broken bones, and verbal cues that include words or phrases that are out of character or unexplained silences from survivors. Again, these aren't the only signs, and every child will be totally different. But if you are concerned, talk to the child in a non threatening environment, avoid judgment and blame, and be patient. Sadly, the impacts of this type of abuse are many. They include the initial effects, such as physical harm, but also include emotional disturbances, physical consequences, for example, STIs, substance use, sexual disturbances, and social disturbances, such as withdrawal. And the effects can include long-term impacts such as depression, self-destruction, somatic disturbances and dissociation, health risk behaviors, again, like sexual risk behaviors, negative self-concepts, long-term interpersonal relationship difficulties, re-victimization, and sexual function difficulties. Again, not all children and adult survivors will experience these effects, and certainly going into therapy to help with these issues around survivorship can be a critical way to minimize the impacts. While complex, there is treatment for child sexual abuse. For survivors, receiving adequate support and therapy is vital. Cognitive behavior therapy has been shown to be efficacious for treating the symptoms of this type of abuse. And for sex abusers and perpetrators, they also have a need for treatment. This often is court ordered and can include intensive group therapy until certain milestones are met. There are also programs that focus on preventing child sexual abuse, such as group instruction in schools, and programs to educate professionals who work puts them in contact with children, such as teachers and social workers. And there have, of course, been laws created to protect communities from potential child sexual predators. Megan's Law, enacted in 1995 and upheld by the Supreme Court in 1997, requires law enforcement authorities to make information about registered sex offenders available to the public. For high-risk offenders, this means providing door-to-door notification of sex offenders in the area. Sex offenders must also register with local authorities. And in most states and in many communities, there have been laws that place numerous restrictions on sex offenders, and all states have internet registries. These laws raise a number of constitutional concerns around privacy and laws related to the restitution that local and state jurisdictions are still grappling with today. And that is the end of this presentation.